Mary Craigle works with the Research and Information Services Bureau at the Department of Commerce, and she is here to talk to us about census differential privacy, as the Brits would say. Jenny, I begged you earlier today to tell us why this is important for commissioners to understand, not because I didn't believe it was important, but because this is a little bit complicated stuff. Can you kind of help set this up?
It's not a little bit complicated. It's very, very complicated. And
yeah.
We'll understand our involvement with the census. Really, we've been involved in working to support the 2020 census since probably 2016 or so. And we still are awaiting our official count for the state of Montana. Mary told me that's coming at the end of this month, we hope. As you know, in addition to our work through the digital library to support the complete and accurate census count, we've been working with public libraries to support that effort. Where the census really comes into play with the state library from a policy perspective is in our state aid to public libraries, both in that the statute that determines how much state funding is awarded in state aid to public libraries is based on the decennial census, and then the actual amount from that total that each individual library receives is based in part on the service area population that a library serves, which is also determined by the decennial census. And as Mary will describe, there's some concern in how the census plans to apply differential privacy that may be problematic, especially for some of our more rural areas of the state. And Ken wisely asked in December, what does differential privacy mean for state aid? And we sort of went, well, that's a really, really, really good question. So thus we are here today.
Well, thank you very much. Mary, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for hanging with us through the meeting this far.
You bet. I'm glad to be here.
Let us know what we need to know.
And Jenny, you just did an excellent job discussing some of the implications. There are so many, it's scary. I would want to add that I don't think this is as controversial as gun safety, but it is definitely very controversial. Everyone on the call should know that yesterday that Montana joined a brief in Alabama that is the suit that is asking for differential privacy. It's called the DAS system, DAS, to not go forward for the U.S. Census Bureau. It's Montana and 16 other states joined yesterday. It's expected that other states will join as well. So the Attorney General for Montana has already made a statement about this process as well. I would have put that in my presentation, but that happened actually last night. So Genevieve, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Yep, go ahead.
Great, thank you.
So the timing, sorry, Mary. So
sure.
Jenny, remind me of our timing for distributing monies.
We do that in the fall, Bruce. Usually
And
around
October. And Mary, is it likely that this suit will be resolved by the fall?
Let's get to that, Bruce.
Okay,
we can go through the presentation just to make sure everybody can see the screen, the slides.
Looks great.
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to give a brief overview of differential privacy, kind of a very short overview. If there's deeper questions, I can get into them, but mainly I want to focus on why the concerns. And again, Bruce, to your question, commissioners, to your question about the timing and the implementation. Overall, this system, this new DAS process could have profound impacts, and I don't say that lightly, on a decade of data quality, on the distribution of resources, and on redistricting representation at legislative commissions, districts, city councils, etc. So those are the three areas that this data has great implications to. Again, as Jenny mentioned, the funding part of it's a key piece, but also just the quality of the data, trying to make planning good community development, and also the redistricting efforts that go on that's based on this data. So high level. So this differential privacy, DP, is beyond a step what has traditionally been the Census Bureau's efforts to keep privacy of an individual. Over the past 6-7 years, the Census Bureau made the determination that they needed to go beyond not only the inability to disclose an individual like Mary Craigle, but they needed to make sure that you couldn't disclose enough characteristics about an individual that it could be matched up against an outside database, like Nielsen or another one of the databases, Facebook, that you couldn't get enough characteristics about Mary Craigle, not knowing her name, that you could match it up with an outside source and figure out that that record was referring to Mary Craigle. Again, that's at every level of geography across all 300+ million people in the United States. Again, this is not the same as the ability for them that they release somebody's identity through the Census Bureau. This is that they could identify somebody using a secondary source. In the history of the Census Bureau, there's only been a breach once, when they used the data for the Japanese internment camp decisions. There's never been a breach of individual data, and in 2010 there were no lawsuits that were filed about data being released that identified an individual. But again, because of the power of computing, the Census Bureau felt they had to go this extra step. This gives a little bit more background that, this is all under Title 13, which is the requirement that keeps everybody, keeps the Census Bureau saying that they have to keep individuals' identity private at every level. So what is differential privacy, and what all differential privacy is? And it looks complicated on the screen, but in reality, all it is it's a mathematical algorithm that allows the injection of statistical noise into the data to prevent any record from providing too much information. And so the reason it's called differential privacy, it's the difference that each individual's record had in comparison to the data. So let's take an extreme example. Let's say in Petroleum County, which is a very small populated county in Montana, that there is a Black African-American individual who's 80 years old. So the inclusion or exclusion of that individual's record into the data for Petroleum County would probably have a noticeable impact based on Petroleum County's overall demographic profile. So what this model does is it adds additional information or basically fuzzies the record, so that that individual's no longer, if you added that individual's record into the data or took it out, it still doesn't have an overall impact on the data point that's shown for Petroleum County. That sounds a lot more complicated than it probably needed to, but that's basically how this works. The chosen blend of accuracy and privacy is called the privacy loss budget. And this is the part of the lawsuit, et cetera, that I think is one of the biggest concerns at this point for these states going forward. So in the overall census, the 2020 census, they are going to have to determine where along this line, what point on this line will be the trade-off between accuracy and privacy. So if they were out here, they would just put out the records exactly as they were collected. So again, remember, this is a census. So this is the population actually talking to, this is not survey data. There's no margin of error. So this is, getting records from every US citizen. So if they put out all the records, we would know everything about those individuals for the questions that were asked on the 2020 census. And the other extreme is over here, where they don't disclose really any characteristics, but the data is so bad that it's so inaccurate that it's very unuseful. So what the Census Bureau is still in the process of trying to determine is where on this line the various they're going to pick for the epsilon for differential privacy. Now, interestingly enough, if you add differential privacy into some areas, you actually have to take it away for others. So if I make the data a little bit more robust accuracy wise for race characteristics, then it's got to be less accurate for some other characteristic, because the epsilon must be set for the entire data set. I'm going to pause for a second. I can't really see questions. So if you have a question, let me know.
Mary, this is Kenning. Can you give an example of what you mean by fuzziness that gets added to a record?
Sure. So what they actually do is they just literally add what they call a statistical noise. So statistical noise is to take the variability but of that specific record or of a specific record and add variability to that record. So instead of saying, and this is not how it works exactly, but let's just simplify it. Instead of saying that person was 80 years old, they'd add enough variability into the data set so that person now might be 40 years old. I mean, that's an extreme example, but what it is it's just adding in mathematically enough variance to the data so that you can no longer identify an individual characteristic. Again, not a person, but you can get down to an individual characteristic of one of the respondents to the 2020 census.
Great, thank you.
This is
Connie. Sure, Connie.
Sorry about that. I just want to make sure I'm following along correctly. And so the 16 or 17 states that have filed this brief is against this?
That is correct.
Okay.
So the brief the state that filed, they filed actually 2 suits. One is about the delay in the redistricting data. Their cycle is much faster than Montana's, so they're in a real crunch because they don't have the redistricting data to actually do redistricting according to their schedule. But the second suit had to do with not using this differential privacy technique with the 2020 data, to defer that decision until later on. Other questions before I move on? Great. So we've talked about differential privacy. So the system, and you'll hear this term that the Census Bureau uses, is called the DAS system, which stands for Disclosure Avoidance System. And all that is that is the name of the technology that, or the system that is cloaking these records. It is very important to note that if DAS goes forward, it will be not only applied to the 2020 census, but it will be applied to all data sources. And so again, as you guys both, not only from your funding standpoint, but as librarians and state policymakers and everything else, it's very important to note that this is going to have some challenges associated with the system. So I've talked a lot about the system and the math. These are the advantages and disadvantages. I'll let you guys look at that kind of at a later date. But here's I think what will really help put the rubber to the road. So here's the key things I want you to take away. So nothing beyond except housing units will remain invariant at every level. By that, I mean, you could go down to the census block level, or you could go to a city, you know, as reported out for the census for the 2020 data, and they will say there's 80 housing units. And that is exactly the number of housing units they counted. They counted 80 housing units. You go to the state level, it says 550,000 housing units for Montana. So at every geographic level, housing units are the only variable that would stay invariant. Population, household characteristics, everything else will not be invariant, except for population at the statewide level. So in a week and a half, the Census Bureau is going to release the numbers for apportionment to determine how many Congress members there are in the House of Representatives for each state. That data, because it's statewide population, will not have any differential privacy added. So the number that we get for the total population count for Montana will be fine. Will be a true census. It will say this is how many people we counted in the effort that the Census Bureau did. But everything at a lower level below that will have statistical noise added to it to varying degrees required to disguise that data. And so the result is that creates some problems. So over the last year and a half, the Census Bureau has provided several different data sets for us to analyze that show what happens when you add data into the, or add this noise into the data. And the major impacts, and Heather Zimmerman has done some of this work with me, that we have determined are basically 4 big areas. Number one, again, any smaller geographic size, the smaller the geography in terms of population or land mass, the greater the distortion. Number two, because of the loss of accuracy, some of these tables that we got from the 2010 census and products will not even be released because they're so inaccurate. They're not even going to produce them. An example would be Summary File 2, which had the tribal affiliation of American Indians. That file's not even going to be produced. They're not going to produce a file of households and characteristics because that data is no longer tied together. They're no longer invariant. Or they will just put dots at certain geographic levels. So many of the small rural towns, places that got data in 2010 will see some of the tables that they got will just be full of dots. They won't have any data in them. And then again, I said, you know, a couple of the tables that won't be produced are the household tables, et cetera. And so the unreliability of the data could impact all kinds of folks. And so we've kind of talked about that. So I'm going to go forward and give you some examples. So the way this table works is this is what was actually reported out of the 2010 census. So when 2010 came out and they gave the breakout for the 989,415 Montana population, this is what they reported, which is at what it adds up to. By adding the statistical noise into the data, it turns the data into this. And this is from the November release that they just put out. So as you can see, there is a pretty dramatic shift in some of these race numbers. And again, this is not actually what is on the ground. Some people, this is just the noise added to the data and the impact it has on the results. I wanted to start with this graph because this is one of the tables that right off the bat, as the person that works with the state, I'm very concerned about because there's a lot of funding that comes into Montana and a lot of decisions that are made based on our largest ethnic race cohort, which is the American Indian Alaska Native population. That is the largest race group that we have in Montana. And because we also have 7 independent reservations equally important to those sovereign nations. So this is a huge concern, as well as I am not quite sure how I explain 1,400 Pacific Islanders in Montana. I mean, and one of the things, you know, that other statisticians that are much more savvy than I am have been pointing out is that, you know, some of just the illogical illogical efforts that sort of come out of this data. I'm going to pause again for any questions. And I see, Connie, you had a question about the slides. I know that Genevieve had emailed them out to folks.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I overlooked that and
Okay, great.
cleared it up for me. Thank you.
I'm going to pause again.
Mary, do you have, or are you planning to share examples of like what this might look like at a county level?
Look at you go, girl.
Excellent.
So the very next few slides do exactly that. So according to, again, let's talking about the American Indian issue. We received $5 million in a single year for Indian housing. And that is based on the number that identified as race or multi-Indian. So that's just one tiny program. There are over 300 programs that use the Census Bureau data to distribute funding. 300 in Montana. We get over somewhere close to 3 billion, well over $2 billion, but very close to 3 billion a year in this state from federal government programs that use census data. And what I have told you is that if this goes forward, and again, they're still working on it, but if it does go forward, that there are going to be impacts to all the data that the Census Bureau produces, other than housing units.
And by impacts, you mean that it may be that Montana or Montana subdivisions receive less money than the actual data would indicate that they should.
Or more money, Bruce. So it's the ironic thing about this is, and I think this next slide will help demonstrate that. So this is the work that Heather Zimmerman did on an earlier data set. So this is one that was produced last July. And again, I want to really stress that this is all still hypothetical because the Census Bureau is continuing to refine this algorithm. So since July of last year, they have made some pretty great improvements, we think, to the data sets. We actually have not received the same data sets so that we could compare. We've been getting different groups of data. So when it came out in July, they did age distributions by gender. The data set I looked at had to do with race and household. So it was very different than the one they produced before. But as you can see, Bruce and the commissioners, I'm just going to call you Bruce because that's the way I do it.
No, that's great. That's great, Mary.
Thank you. Sorry. As you can see, so again, the DAS is applied. Is the blue lines, and the brown is the actual reported numbers that came out of the census. So what came out of the census, looking at this, just the female side, you can see that, Carter County in their planning or in terms of funding they might get for small children, infants, etc., the census is going to say, well, there were 58-ish in that age cohort, but in fact, there were 20. So that's a case where they might actually get more funding, but it's not representative of what is truly going on in Carter County. And on the flip side, for this 20 to 24-year-olds for new education programs, etc., they're going to think there isn't as many. There's 8 as opposed to the 30 that actually existed.
Mary, I have another question. This is Jenny again.
Sure.
Does that mean that is there some kind of relationship amongst the counties when you're looking at this data? So if Carter County shows that they have significantly higher in the 45 to 49 age bracket, is there corollary decreases in other counties in Montana?
Not necessarily in terms of any of the characteristic. The only corollary, the only level that is related across all the counties is the fact that it has to add up to whatever the new total population is.
The total populations.
Right. So if they add people in one county or area, they have to they have to balance that out with add, meaning that the data, that the statistical noise adds people. The statistical noise has to reduce people in other areas.
Yes, good, thank you.
But everything else, I mean, you could have overstated characteristics in any of the other areas, and there's no need to keep it consistent, other than the metric that's going to say state is really bad, we can't produce this table. You guys following along? Everybody doing okay? Okay. The next one, commissioners, is that the impact of size. So I thought this was really interesting. And again, this came out of this last data set that we have. Oops. And that is, so again, think about a town. So a big city like Billings, you have enough people that individual characteristics are masked just surely because of the population size. The smaller you get, the more difficult it is to mask characteristics, to mask race, to mask gender, age, ethnicity, household relationships. Are you a grandparent? All these different things that the census tracks. And so you can see the smaller populations, how different it is. And again, for your libraries, I think this is kind of important that not only planning and for the funding side of it, but for the planning and just what you are relating to folks about the community in which everybody lives. I have one more example and then we can, we'll be done. So then the second, so I talked about funding. We've talked about the Carter County and the planning, the problem for, knowing what your age groups are and overstating or understating that. The third area, again, that census data is used is for districting. And so this is an example, looking at the data, even though it's pretty small in terms of the amount of change, what is happening here. So this is the Evergreen area, which is really the part of the urban area of Kalispell. And this is an area that is shifting more of this urban area out into the rural. Now, remember, this data is used not only for legislative districts, but it's also used for school boards, city councils, to determine the size and makeup. So that shift means that the constituents in those areas may be slightly impacted by who represents them in terms of what they think the size of their councils and districts and et cetera should be. This also applies in terms of the redistricting data that the apportionment committee is getting ready to get right now, in terms of the two questions related to legislative redistricting are minority representation and voting age population. And as you can see here, the area that has much higher percentage-wise of American Indian identified as a race from the 2010 data is being reduced, and other areas are being added to that had a much lower level of American Indian identified population. And then finally, the same thing with the voting age, where you're taking away from some districts and adding them over to other districts. So when they are drawing these lines based on the data that they are going to get for redistricting, which will have DAS, the intent by the Census Bureau is to have the differential privacy applied to that data at everything below the state level. Those lines will be impacted by the DAS. More importantly, there is no way, because we will not know the precise data, the only way you can see the precise data is to go to a census research center and get approval to look at certain data for basically a PhD project. They would never allow you to look at the whole state. So we won't know truly what the shift is. We will get metrics overall that say that, race was impacted this way or that way, or a number of grandparents characteristic type things were impacted this way or that way, but we won't know the the specific shifts that are occurring. So right now, the current planning is the apportionment files I mentioned is going to be released at the end of the month. Keep your fingers crossed, thanks to all the great work of the libraries, that we might get another congressperson. We will know that here shortly. Second, but at that same time, they are going to release another data file. And again, as I mentioned before, they continue to try to refine this algorithm so that some of the errors that you've seen may not be as glaring, but there still are going to be significant impacts, no matter as long as they move this forward, there are going to be significant impacts. In early June, they make the final decision on exactly where on that line, the privacy line that we talked about, where they are going to put that point, and everything that falls from beneath that. In September is when the redistricting data will come out, as well as all the larger data set, the first big data set from the 2020 census, which will have characteristics of population down to the census block level all the way up across the entire state. So that's really that first big data set that we get from the 2020 census. So in summary, and thanks for hanging in there with me. The Census Bureau is continuing to refine this. We have this, like I said, I did this before. This is the suit that Alabama filed. Montana has joined that suit in an amicus brief as of last night. We found that out. Redistricting data, an initial data set is expected the end of August, but I didn't put that in the timeline because they've shifted this like 5, 6, 7 times. But that is kind of the current date in the legacy format, and then another different format as of the end of September. So that's the dates you can start to really see what the impact of DAS would be, and the first big data sets that are coming out from the 2020 census. And again, obviously, as it will require a lot of existing statutes, rules. I sent out a handout as well that showed my findings of going through rules and statutes and the Constitution of common census terms. I can tell you right now that not all those terms are directly related to census products, they could be. And I think it's important to realize that how frequently those terms are used, and that we don't really have a good set of references to the definitions behind those terms. So what can we do? We need to educate ourselves, which check, you did that today. Continue to follow the committee's work. At the end of this presentation, there's a link to the committee. Please, this is the big one for me, is to share this, let other folks know, be informed. Again, we're talking, this is coming out in September, but the decision's going to be made next month, in June. And once it's set, it's, other than the proceeding, the lawsuits that are going forward, it will be very difficult for it to be modified in any kind of way. So please, if you have concerns, please let them know, and then start working on a contingency planning. So now that you know what this could do, we have talked about other data sources rather than the census for looking at communities, having to do surveys, etc. So all those things, knowing what could be about, if you have critical programs in your community that serve underage kids, or a specific racial population, or an aging population, now is the time to start thinking about what those impacts will be. And that's more stats than you guys have had for a very long time. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary. This was so helpful. So asking about the suit that's been filed, they are asking for the DAS process to not be followed, and so the result would be that the census would use their historical differential privacy practices. Is that true?
So we don't actually, so the Census Bureau has really doubled down on the DAS. They really have not come out and said that they would use the same method they employed in 2010. So in 2010, what they did is they just swapped households.
Yeah.
So if that petroleum individual, that person we talked about, they would swap that household out of there with a different household, so that the data statistically was still within a very high confidence of representing the overall population for petroleum, but would not have had that specific household in it. That is the method they have used for the last, I think, 30 years, is changing those households, I think since maybe 40 years, maybe since the 70s. But the Census Bureau, in the calls and in conversations we've had with them, have not have pretty much said they did not
Senator
look at
Dean's
any
office
other.
That he is going to put a bill and doubt if it'll pass, but on SOP to limit the extension.
They
to
did
only
not
go
look
to
at
21.
any other statistical method that might have worked as a way to disguise this data. And although I have a degree from a very long time ago in quantitative analysis, I am not aware of anything that would work to do what they are trying to do, which is, again, not make sure that nobody's individual privacy is given, nobody's individual identity, but just that you couldn't even figure out and characteristics to a level that you could use a secondary data source and figure out who Mary Craigle is. So I have an overall question back to you, Commissioner Bruce Newell, and that is, do you think this was worth the commission's time? Because hopefully it was.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I want to thank you for being aware of this and kind of bird dogging it. I mean, this is great stuff. It's hard stuff. As a librarian divorced from the commission, I'm more than slightly offended by the notion that, series of data will no longer be as reliable or as indicative of what's on the ground. And that makes me sort of crazy because, numbers are kind of sacred, at least in that, to me. But as from the commission's point of view, we need, we're working at doing a better job at getting sufficient library services to everyone. Particularly, I'm personally concerned, as are many of those on this call, with getting services to certain, subgroups, the tribes or areas that have not seen adequate library services because of the size or poverty or education or whatever that is. And this blunts our ability to do this. And that makes me nuts. And I have a note here, work with Jenny to think about this. But also contingency planning, should we do a good enough job at distributing funds to public libraries around the state? That sort of offends me. I mean, I'm bothered by that. No, yes, Mary, this is very important, but very much like that delightful conversation about guns, it leaves me with more questions, albeit perhaps better informed questions than I entered with. So, I thank you for this presentation, but wow.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And thanks again, everybody, for the time too.
We have a couple questions that I can
You
see
bet.
on my screen. Kenning and Connie. Kenning first?
I think Connie was actually first. Go ahead,
Oh,
Connie.
I can't see that. Okay, Connie? Oops, unmute.
I said, thanks, Kenning. I feel like I'm missing something here. Yeah, the sacrifice of information integrity doesn't seem to be a good payoff for what you're describing. So I don't understand how it got to this level of consideration. I don't
Sure.
know. And also, like, it just seems like with the sophistication we have, that a more nuanced approach could.
Yeah.
So I feel like
So Connie, you will be delighted to know that I was actually at a state meeting in 2019 with the Census Bureau, the first time we heard about this in October, and expressed those exact concerns, and was basically sort of called out as being disrespectful for raising it. What happened here is two things. The Census Bureau actually has a history of doing this. So in the 1920s, there was no reapportionment after the 1920 census. And the part of the reason there was no reapportionment into the 1920 census is because two different mathematicians got in a standoff about how really to give out the information. And what has happened in this cycle is this differential privacy issue came up in the context of the CSTAT groups, which are the mathematical modelers and folks at Census, and their concerns, but they never included anyone that works with the data directly in any of those conversations. That did not occur at any level of widespread input until 2019. And by that point, the Census Bureau had kind of already doubled down on, no, we have to do this. And you know, and what it all boils down to is their interpretation of Title 13. So Title 13 says they can't give out individual privacy. Well, the question becomes, have they gone too far? Is this a step beyond, because you have to use an outside data source to identify an individual by name? And have they gone too far? And I think that's really, and I have not read, I've only read summaries of the Alabama case. I haven't read the case itself, but my guess is that's kind of what that hinges on, is that in part that they have gone to this extreme step, as some would say, a solution begging for a problem, given that no one sued in 2010 over the release of information. That's a long-winded answer, but hopefully that helps.
that's helpful.
The other thing I just want to comment too, I mean, the US Census data is the gold standard. I mean, there is no other data. It's funny because people will say, and I know Superintendent Artson's on the phone, they'll say, well, just call the school district and find out how big the population of school kids is. That's census data. The US Census Bureau does practically every survey for every agency or any kind of data that you get at almost every geographic level. So like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that information is actually done by the Census Bureau, and they provide the information to the BLS. And again, I want to stress that the Census Bureau plan at this point is to apply this fuzziness to all those data sets. So again, the census is the best data set you have, where it has no margin of error. As you apply DAS to these other products that do have a statistical margin of error because they're samples, they're surveys, that it just enhances the impacts. If this goes forward again.
Thank you. Kenning?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Mary, thank you very much. This was absolutely worthwhile, and I really appreciate you bringing this to us, and what a great presentation. Thank you. I wasn't aware of this. So, I mean, so many thoughts have been floating around in my mind. I'll try to organize them a little bit. First of all, I hope that you're correct that the algorithm that they are using will be smoothed out, because it just seems like in some cases it's creating chaos. And God, I can't imagine how anyone thinks that that's really an improvement. Secondly, I wonder if there's a conversation occurring anywhere about the futility of government trying to protect privacy at all, when so many citizens, so many of us, just give up our information, data about ourselves freely to
Absolutely.
you know, all kinds of social media organizations and God knows what other trackers, are collecting data about us, and whether privacy is even possible in this day and age. I mean, I think privacy just doesn't exist anymore on some level. And then finally, one of the things that I always think that government can do is require us as state agencies or institutions of higher education, in my case, is to force us to apply privacy protection measures that are there that we simply don't use. Things like using secure HTTP for our websites to encrypt transactions when users use our websites, or there are features, for instance, in Google Analytics that we don't turn on and that we don't use that are designed to protect privacy. But of course, Google would prefer we don't use them, but they're there. So I don't know. It's just a flurry of thoughts running through my mind, and frankly, I'm upset about this.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, thanks. And I've been upset about it for two years, but trying to, conduct a census where we had as best account as we could, because I think that, so what's the only, there's a couple of silver linings. So the silver lining is the data did get collected. It would be even worse if we didn't have the actual data. And they have, so that's one positive thing, so that they can mathematically fuzzy it, but at least the data is fairly well collected. Now we can talk about how well the census went. That's a different topic. But that is definitely a point. The second silver lining is that they have woken a very sleeping bear. So as you notice, is 16 states signing on to this Urban League, a whole bunch of various racial and ethnic organizations have also been signing on to this. So there is a great outcry about this topic. And I totally agree with you, Kenny, in that there's also not only a question about the privacy side, but what is the damages question? If I am the 90-year-old African-American individual living in Petroleum County, everyone knows who I am, right? I mean, everyone knows. And so what's the risk, the downside of that information's in the table? So that's a whole different issue. I would love to hear, now that we know that the AG's office has gone along with the suit, I would love to hear what their arguments are and what they are thinking in terms of pursuing this. I have not been involved in any conversations with them other than a very, very brief conversation 5 months ago about how did the census go with one of the folks over there. So I'd be very interested to know what they're thinking.
Ken.
Thanks, Mary. That was an incredibly good presentation. Really
Thank you.
One of it was interesting, and I encourage people, I think that the GeoCon, the state GIS conference, was virtually happened 2 weeks ago. And I think those sessions were all recorded, or most of them were, and urge people to listen to the census segment in that, both at the national level. And there was a very good statistician on there, Lacey Laughlin was her name. She completely dissed this subject. I called her out on it specifically a couple times. And she basically said, this is nothing to be worried about. We've done this for many decades, which I was not aware of. So I appreciate your nuances there, Barry, in terms of what happened last time and in previous years and the history of it. And she said, we won't even notice this. I think she kind of didn't realize how rural Montana is, but it is very troubling. And I think that in terms of our specific decisions with the library, in terms of how to allocate these funding in the fall when we get to this, she had indicated also, she gave apparently some other, she said this wouldn't be just this final decision on how differential privacy was applied wouldn't be decided until October. I think she was, from what you're saying, referring to when the data would be released rather than when the decisions made. But one of the bottom lines here is we do have, at least in Montana, pretty good housing unit information. And I think that's a critical nuance. And I think the way they applied it from what you said in 2010 versus 2020, there's a big shift there in terms of the ramifications. And when you think back to when the census was taking place and our political situation, our president at the time, and various other subjects, I think there was concern about, would the census be jeopardized? So I think that plays into this as well, kind of behind the scenes a little bit.
Totally can. Yeah, and interestingly enough, just so you know, we were cheering you on in your discussions with her, Dave Ritz, and I, and we actually have contacted Stacy separately. What that points to more than anything else is the siloed nature of the Census Bureau, and and we do this, right? We're in state government. We do the state government speak thing where we all just carry one for the cause and don't really have the background information that we need to know. I mean, the Census Bureau has done, the new Commerce Secretary just this last week came out and said, oh no, we're going to do this differential privacy. It's no big deal. So they are really just, she was really just talking about what she has heard internally. And again, they did not involve the data users. Every state and territory in the nation has a state data center. So there's a Mary Craigle equivalent in every state and territory. And we were not included at all into any of this discussion until the very end of 2019, when it was already well down the path. But we did call out Stacy separately and informed her how she was pretty wrong in many of her much of her understanding. And that's my other big concern, is that again, if you look at all the silos of the department, I mean, this DAS stuff is going to be on the economic census too. So it's all the business data. It's on every other data set. And if the Census Bureau employees themselves think it's no big deal and it's not important, they're going to resist, I think how this is moving forward, it's going to cause even more friction overall all over this discussion.
Yeah, so I think the bottom line is it's not a done deal, but I mentioned earlier in our meeting that part of NextGen is identifying structure locations on the rooftop of the house. And so that's even more important, I think, that we encourage local governments to do that and verify it. It isn't going to happen by October when we have to make a decision or on our current allocation of money, but it is something that you do have a pretty good chance of getting a really good map of that. And that's not going to answer all the questions on how to deal with this, but it'll give us a tool that we can apply, compare at least something that doesn't change over time. So it gives us some tools. I think we should really encourage that to happen. And we are, like through House Bill 50, I think we are seeing that probably going to come to play.
Thank you, Ken. Erin?
Thank you, Bruce. So I just wanted to inform everyone that that NSGIC, the National States Geographic Information Council, has been working with Mary and her professional organization, the State Data Centers, not Mary specifically, the professional organization.
I'm on the steering committee nationally, so yes, they have.
State's data center and state demographers. And when we initially heard this come out at the beginning of 2020, I think that's when I first had heard about it. It was pretty shocking, and it was called by one of Mary's colleagues in one of the conferences I went to as irresponsible and foolish to put this into play because of the dispersion of diversity. So the National States Geographic Information Council is following this. They have started. They had over a year ago started the working group and just trying to gather as much information and people as possible to kind of put some pressure on the U.S. Census Bureau. There's some letters that were drafted, but I think the person who kind of brought it up was my colleague in Arizona, because she was working with Maricopa County, and they estimated with the city of Phoenix just in the first year losing $8.4 million based on based on some of the calculations they did. So I think it's really important. And Mary, can you talk a little to the comparison of data sets over time?
Sure.
It-
And so, yeah, there's been 3 different data sets, well, 3.5 different data sets, because, you know, with statisticians can never do anything easy. So initially they put out this product called the demonstration project, which is where they basically took all the number of the 2010 tables from summary file 1, files you're used to, which show population by county, by race, by those kinds of things, and applied the the DAS to those files. And in the words of John Aboud, who is the guy that's really the director of all these efforts, he was shocked by the results and what the impact was. The algorithm was so bad at that point that even the Census Bureau was shocked to see what it did. And so they, from that point forward, worked on refining, have been working on refining the algorithm. The second data set was produced in July of 2020. And again, that one only had characteristics of county by age groups. So that's the one where you saw the Carter County slide. And again, so you saw that, well, that's still pretty problematic. And so the third data set that was produced in September. However, they found that there was a big error in the algorithm at that point. So they put out another data set in November, and that is the most recent data set that we have gotten. So there will be another data set that will be produced at the end of, that is supposed to be provided at the end of this month. We don't know what that data set will cover. We don't know if it'll be replicate one of the previous data sets so we can see the improvements, or if it'll be yet another totally different topic. But when it does come out, I will work my best to come up with some examples and what that does compared to what we've already seen. There's 132,000 census blocks in Montana. And every one of them builds back up to the state level. So every time you produce any kind of file, you have to start at that level and work forward. So it's a challenge. And the Census Bureau has made it, for me, and as a member of the National Steering Committee, has made it very difficult for us to be engaged, to know what, to be involved, to be part of this process. And why we don't, it's a big federal government agency, but it has definitely not been an easy time.
So Jenny, you had your hand up. I guess I actually have a couple questions. One is, as per the agenda, so what does this mean specifically to the state library with its per capita per state aid thing? I guess I have a second question for you, and then you may have questions for Mary. But do you believe that the commission might well serve Montana by making a comment about this to somebody?
That was going to be one of my questions to you, Bruce, and the commission is, do we want to send a letter or some other kinds of communication to this body, also expressing our concerns? I have reached out to the AG's office and asked for a copy of that amicus brief. So I've been told that will be shared. So Mary, I'll make sure you get a copy of that too, if you don't have it through other means. But so that's my first question for you. I certainly think it would be appropriate for this commission as a body to share the concerns that I hear being voiced here.
Just a quick straw poll with commissioners, thumbs up or thumbs down. Do you think we should draft something, circulate it for comment and review, and then if there's general approval, send it off to whoever it needs to be sent off to? So that looks good. Okay, good. Okay, so
the state data centers and the FSCPE, the Federal Statistical Population Estimate Groups, are both partners with Census. They both have written letters. I will share the one that we wrote to the SDC, to Jenny, so that you can kind of use that to see what some of the issues and stuff that we raised. It might make the drafting a little quicker.
That sounds good. Jenny, you and Aaron will sort of take the lead on that.
Bet. Yeah.
And I totally agree. I'm glad we're doing that. I'm with Ken. This really concerns me. So, okay, that's one thing.
So number 2, so I have some additional legal guidance from when we met and talked about this in March. And I'm not entirely satisfied with the guidance. I think it ties our hands, but it is the advice that we've received both from the Secretary of State's office as we explored the administrative rules options, as well as our attorney, Jeff Dowd. So in March, we had talked about the possibility of adopting temporary rules that would allow the state library to use something other than the decennial census for determining the award of state aid down to the local library level. As Mary said, in the next week and a half or so, we should have that total population count for Montana, which will determine the total pot of money for state aid. So that isn't in question. And we've been already having conversations with the governor's budget office about getting that amount appropriated. So that really isn't in question. We're just waiting for the population count. We had originally gotten advice from Jeff Dowd that in order to use something other than the decennial census for that per capita portion of the per capita per square mile formula for distributing state aid, that we would need to change administrative rule, and had worked through a process and timeline to look at different data sources that we might use as alternatives and allow us to kind of compare and contrast what that would mean for the distribution of state aid pending outcomes like the suit that Mary mentioned that's been filed by other states and the decisions that are coming forward from the census. When Genevieve was researching how to go about implementing these temporary rules, someone from the Secretary of State's office got back to us and said, because statute determines that the total amount of state aid is determined by census, that statutory requirement carries sway over how we apply the administrative rule.
Yep.
And that's really frustrating for me because that administrative rule has been in place long before the statutory appropriation for state aid, which tied it to census.
Yep.
So the only option we would have now is to actually change statute, which we of course don't want to do. No time to do at this point.
Yeah, you actually can't. So that's the other big problem, because the bills have already passed transmittal, everything else is behind us. The only way that statute can change for any of these issues, and that's why I wanted to make sure you guys had that handout, is for them to come back.
Yeah. So we don't
come back. Yeah.
So we don't really have an option at this point other than to use the census. So I think at this point, I think it's right for the commission to have a voice in the concerns that we have. I think we will obviously monitor and give voice wherever we can until these determinations are made. And if the process involves the use of DAS in determining that kind of population, evaluate what kind of impact it's going to have on our distribution of state aid and be prepared to provide information to libraries that might be otherwise negatively impacted.
Well, Mary, thank you again for coming. Obviously, this is something that concerns us in both meanings of the word. We're basically inextricably caught up in this, however it works out. And also many of us have some genuine concerns about this. So this was very, very helpful.
Thank you. And thanks again so much for the time. And again, if you guys, the big thing I would ask is please get the word out on this. I just feel that, I've tried to do that as much as I can of late, the last month or two, but I just am really concerned that people are going to be caught so unaware about what the impact's going to be for their planning, for their funding, and on these various boundary lines that are going to be impacted.
So we'll work, Jenny, on the on that letter. That letter can also serve as maybe as a serve two purposes, also as kind of a memo to public libraries, informing them of what we're navigating and possible outcomes and possible timelines.
Okay.
And, we might even want to talk about that on Friday
Sounds good.
briefly, although these are deep and turbulent waters. Well, so commissioners, staff, so it's 12:40 approximately now. We have a few items left on our agenda. I hate to shortchange some of the remaining items on our agenda by having everyone hungry and ready to gnaw off their hands. Would you like to break until 1 and then come back after a quick lunch, or what are commissioners, what are your preferences? Let me make that simpler. How many people want to take a 20-minute break and come back after some sort of a lunch-like activity? How many people would rather charge right ahead? So I think majority rules. Sorry, Jamie. So we'll come back at 1 and we'll pick this up again. And I look forward to seeing you all in about 20 minutes. Mary, if there's something I can do to help with this process, I can be reached through Jenny, and I'm very concerned about this. And
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, and again, as I
let's
get
stay on this.
updates when that new data set comes out, I'll share everything I can.
But let's stay on this. This is important.
Yeah, and Kenning, anything for the university system, they're not folks just are not tracking this. And we did make a decision, like I said, during the 2020 census, not to talk about it because we wanted people to still fill out the form so we could get the data, hoping that DAS was going to go away or be modified to the point where it'd be okay. Now we're at the point where we just need DAS to be modified or go away to be okay. But thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Mary, it's
Time.
okay to share or use your presentation?
It is, and actually, it's actually become kind of a thing. So my presentation, I shared it with the state data centers, and they're adapting it in Oklahoma and Washington State and other places. I put this presentation together and then ran it through a whole bunch of my SDC colleagues who made fantastic changes. But it is kind of like the first presentation that we have that's been put together since this last data set came out.
Great.
So
Thank you.
Well, the reason that people copy Montana is because we have such good people.
Well, thanks. I think I'm just Scottish and stubborn and just passionate, but I am passionate about this issue. As you all know, I've been in this job for 10 years, and this is incredibly concerning.
Yeah.
It just to move away from the gold standard the Census Bureau is for the data and what it means to the U.S. population, and then expect that you're going to regain that position isn't going to happen. So I'm glad to see that other attorney generals and stuff have signed on to the suit, especially ours.